Welcome to the Best 5-Minute Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Forrest Kelly. From the seed to the glass, wine has a past. Our aim at the Best 5-Minute Wine Podcast is to look for adventure at wineries around the globe. After all, great minds think alike. Let's start the adventure. Our featured winery is... We continue our conversation with Vito, founder of winecork.com. So growing up in southern Italy with your dad being a salesman, a sartorial salesman, did he teach you directly or indirectly?
Not indirectly. So growing up, when I was little, I was like 3-4 years old. Back as I can remember, my family owned a shop. It was like a very, very small shop. And so growing up, I would see my dad just, building that business up, the small business. And so having, just kind of like, that's maybe where I got my entrepreneurship, gene from. But he's never really sat down with me and told me how to sell or just how to approach things. I just always watched my parents kind of go through life. So that's kind of where I learned it from.
That's a beautiful thing when a father can pass along to his son some charismatic sales techniques. And as that happened, how did that dovetail into your love of wine?
I was working one summer at a famous hotel in Italy. I was in college at that time. I attended a free wine tasting, for employees. And at the time, I knew nothing about wine. Wine has always been around, but I knew nothing about it. And to be honest, I didn't even like it. But it was free. All my friends were gone, so why not? The first hour and a half about, we're all talking about wine and minerality, mushrooms, candied fruit, you name it. I thought everyone had lost it. I was ready to leave. And then a guy walks up on stage and he just told us stories about his grandfather, about wars and how, land divisions from thousands, of years ago still impact wine today. And then one thing he said that stayed with me was what's important is everything around a glass, not inside. It's the people, the tradition, the history. That's what matters. That guy, was Angelo Gaia, which is, Italy's greatest, best winemakers. And so that was a turning point for me. That's when I realized wine isn't just a drink that sits on the table. It's stories, it's people, and it's a way for me to learn more about the world. So I went to business school in Florence, business finance. I always loved numbers. When I was working on a summer job, I got into wine. And so that kind of like took a different path. A common theme of my life has always been storytelling. It's just something I've always loved, just history and stories. So it's always been a big part of my journey. And, always loved, discovering stories behind, producers and just understanding what inspires them. So fast forward 2 years later, I moved to New York City.
So moving from southern Italy to the Big Apple, to New York, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I moved to New York City, I started working in the wine industry. First, I worked for a distributor. So I was basically selling Italian wines, and then worked as a sommelier at Giorgio Armani, where I had the opportunity to meet producers from all over the world. It was really awesome connecting with them and sharing their stories with other people.
Whoa, hang on a second there. You kind of glossed over the sommelier part. That's no small task.
It was not the common path where, you go and, to school and, you just study, get your course. To me, it's always been about, again, I worked sales, so it wasn't really on the floor, which is what I did at Giorgio Armani. It was just passion. I kept reading and studying. It's very interesting because there was a point where I was selling Italian wine. So I was working for a distributor. So that's a sales job, right? You don't have to have a degree or anything in wine. And then through that, I was basically selling to restaurants. And so that's kind of why I got myself into restaurants. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. You get to drink great wines. You get to sell great wines. So, top Burgundy, right? Grand Cru Burgundies, First Growth Bordeaux, Champagne. And so I had friends who would tell me about all those wines that were opening. And I was like, well, I wish I could drink them. And so a way for me to kind of get involved with it was to work restaurants, right? To be on the other side because I couldn't afford them. So I joined Giorgio Armani, started working in restaurants, and that's how it started.
In our next episode, we get into the specifics of winecork.com as we continue our conversation with the founder, Vito. Thank you for listening. I'm Forrest Kelly. This episode of the Best 5-Minute Wine Podcast was produced by iHism. If you like the show, please tell your friends and pets and subscribe. Until next time, pour the wine, and ponder your next adventure.
This is Doug Vincent with the podcast Walk and Roll Live, Disability Stories. In 1956, I contracted polio. Thanks to my loving parents, I've lived a full, rich life over the past 67 years. Join me as I share my journey and uncover inspiring stories of resilience. This podcast is a platform for survivors of disability and those who champion services for the disabled community. Tune in on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Let's walk and roll together on this incredible journey of strength and empowerment.